So the first 2 weeks ago we looked at the life of Muhammad, and then last week we looked at the general beliefs and practices of Islam, the 5 pillars of faith. And so now we'll carry on completing that and then looking at a bit of the history. So one question is, people often talk about Sharia, and you hear a lot about it in the newspapers these days. Muslims want to have Sharia law in Britain and in fact in every country of the world. And so what is Sharia? Well, basically the meaning, the sort of oldest meaning of the word is it's connected to the word path. And so it's often understood as being a straight path to God. The sort of general understanding is Islamic law, but in terms of the etymology, the sort of meaning, it refers to a straight path to God. So by following this path, then one can achieve a relationship with God. One can come into the realm of this kind of relationship with God. And so, as I said before, Muslims also recognize other books of scripture. They recognize the Torah, all these different books of scripture that were given to different prophets. But they say that the fastest or the shortest or the straightest way to God is actually to follow the Sharia, which is laid down in the Quran, based on the Quran, whereas then other books have become corrupted, other scriptures become corrupted, so they're not quite as direct. And so the Sharia then basically describes the limits of acceptable behavior. It says, this is the limit of what you can do, and as long as you stay within this space, then you are walking on the path to God. And so we'll look in a bit more detail at the content of the Sharia in the next slide. So a sin then, from a Muslim point of view, a sin is an offense against God. It's crossing the boundary. So it's like you're going up the motorway, and there's lines, and little bumps. What do they call these bumps?
Cat's eyes.
That's like cat's eyes in the middle, and you have little things. And if you go too far, if you start drifting off the road, you get bap, 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 bap. That's to remind you to go back and stay on the straight path. And so if you sin, then you're crossing the boundary and you're going off the road, and you sort of have an accident, and you're going cross country, and progress is really slow. So the worst sin is called shirk, and so that is an offense against God. That is saying that God has a partner. And so we discussed this before, that the sort of crude understanding of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is that God is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And from a Muslim point of view, this is shirk, because it's giving the impression that God has a partner, God has an equal, God has a partner. But actually, Islam is monotheistic, very strictly monotheistic. It's interesting, actually, because this ISIS thing that's going on. Okay, so this comes from a particular strand of Islam called the Wahhabi strand of Islam, which is very, very strict. And so they're very, very strict monotheists. And so traditionally within Islam, especially in Shia Islam, Muslims have had a lot of respect for saints, and they've had the tombs of the saints, and they've respected the tombs of the saints, and they might have gone there and prayed there. And Muhammad's house also in Medina was preserved. Muhammad's tomb was preserved. And but the Wahhabis, they think that's wrong. And so systematically over since about the 1930s, then the Wahhabi strand of Islam, which is very closely connected to the House of Saud, has been going systematically through Mecca and Medina, destroying all these ancient monuments and destroying all these ancient buildings, destroying the tombs of the prophets. And they now even want to destroy the house of Muhammad, because they say it's wrong for people to venerate Muhammad. You understand? So that's what ISIS is like that as well. It's extreme monotheism and rejection of any kind of respect or veneration of the saints, which one has often found within most Muslim branches of Islam.
They are Shiites, are they?
The Shia do. They respect the saints, and they would venerate the saints, and they'd have mosques and monuments and tombs of the saints.
Are the Wahhabis Shiites or the
No,
Sunnis?
Sunni.
Or the Sunnis, that's it.
It's a very strict Sunni sect and extremely anti-Western. And so it's basically the ISIS then come out of this kind of extreme puritanical strand or strain of Islam. Muhammad himself apparently spoke against it because he regarded them as being too fanatical, too extreme. So it's interesting. So you have this very extreme monotheism. You shouldn't respect or worship or have any veneration for anybody except God. And then within Christianity, and so that means that this gives license then for the followers of the Wahhabis to kill other Muslims, because they say those other Muslims are deviants, they're corrupted. There's only one pure strain of Islam, which is the Wahhabi strain of Islam. These sort of ideas developed really in the 18th century in Arabia, and they became dominant when in Arabia became Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud was very connected to the Wahhabi. And so the House of Saud have been trying to manage the Wahhabis for the last few decades. And so they've, because they're very violent, and so they've been channeling a lot of this. So that's why a lot of the people, Al-Qaeda, they came from Saudi Arabia, and they've been channeling a lot of this money into culturally trying to influence Muslims all over the world to adopt this very extreme strain of Islam. All right. But it's interesting, I was just thinking about it today because, as I said, Christians believe in the Trinity, which, as I said, it looks like God, Jesus is God from a Christian point of view, and the Holy Spirit is God. Also, Christians will, especially Catholics and the Orthodox, they'll venerate and worship and pray to the saints like Mother Mary and other saints. So that's one end. And then you have the sort of Islam and the Wahhabi version of Islam at the other extreme. And then you have Judaism, which is really in the middle. So what's the second commandment? No, what's the first commandment?
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
That's right. Which is interesting. That you shall have, doesn't say, it's not you shall have no other gods. It's you shall have no other gods before me. That means you can worship and venerate other people and other things, but God is number one. So there's a sort of a middle path, which I find quite interesting. Whereas Islam is very, very sort of extreme. Anyway, so that's the first sin. And so from a Muslim point of view, all Christians are going to hell because they believe in the Trinity. The only Christians who aren't going to hell are the Unitarians, because they believe Jesus is a human being. Anyway. Then another kind of sin is zalim, which is hurting others. So the first one is shirk, is an offense against God. Second, zalim, when you hurt others, through violence, or another level of sin is lying, cursing, envy. Then only God can forgive sin if one sincerely repents. And but the point here is that God can only forgive the sins against God. God can't forgive sins that you commit against somebody else. Okay, so if you offend somebody, God can't forgive you for offending somebody. The only person who can forgive you is the person you offended. Okay?
Is that Islam?
That's Islam, yes. So again, that's different to the sort of Catholic idea. You go and commit adultery, or you do various sins, and you go to confession, and you're forgiven, given absolution. From a Muslim point of view, it doesn't work. The only person who can forgive you is the person who you offended. God can't forgive you those sins. God can only forgive the sins that you commit against God. Maybe cursing or something like this, if you sincerely repent. Anyway, I also believe in this thing called Judgment Day, very much like the Christians. On the Day of Judgment, and all the deeds you've done will be weighed up. All the good deeds you've done will be weighed up, and all the bad deeds you've done will be weighed up. And then you either go to heaven or you go to hell. So the very literal understanding of this, but again, it's based on deeds. And so within Sharia then, they have punishment. So the purpose of punishment is as a deterrent. Okay, it's not seen as revenge, but as a deterrent. So you will say, why do people? One of the punishments for theft is you chop somebody's hand off. That's actually the law in many Muslim countries. People who steal have their hands chopped off. So the purpose of that is as a deterrent, to deter people from stealing. It's not seen as retribution. It's not seen as anything like that. It's deterrence. And also to reform criminals and to protect society. So that's the reason for punishments. But if somebody commits murder, then they'll be taken to court quite quickly. Within a few days, they'll be found guilty, and they can be put to death, beheaded or something, or stoned. But then they can be released. But this is only if the family of that person who's murdered agrees to it. So this person can ask for forgiveness, and if he sincerely asks for forgiveness, then the family might forgive him and he won't be punished. Or they can say, well, we want to have, a certain sum of money or something, and then we'll forgive you. So it's very different to the courts as they work here, a different system of justice. And also works differently. When they have prosecutions, then they don't rely on evidence for finding someone innocent or guilty. They rely upon witnesses, oral testimony, not written evidence, not DNA. These sort of things aren't admissible. It's only basically just witnesses and oral evidence. And so, of course, it works well in some things, but not in others. So, for example, if a woman's raped, then the person who raped her can only be found guilty as if 4 people saw it taking place. DNA, all this sort of stuff, that's not admissible into court. So it's interesting. So these are obviously rules that were drawn up a long, long time ago, and these rules still apply. So it hasn't been reformed at all in that sense, in terms of bringing it up to date with take into consideration modern forms of evidence. And then you won't have a jury. The plaintiff and the defendant will appear in front of the judge and plead their cases, and the judge will decide one way or the other. And if the person who is accused gives an oath on the Quran that he is innocent, that is held as evidence that that person didn't commit a crime. So a huge amount of weight is placed upon people's integrity, that they're willing to tell the truth at the end of the day. So sometimes people tell lies and say, I didn't do it, until then they get in the court and they have to take an oath, and then they say, yes, I did do it. Because taking oaths is somehow very significant, very important. People should be honest and trustworthy when they're taking an oath on the Quran. So justice then is usually very, very quick. It doesn't drag on for weeks and months and years like it does, here or in most Western countries. You usually get a verdict within within a very short time. But the punishments are still the way they were: beheadings, stoning, having your hands chopped off. They don't generally speaking, people don't end up in prison.
So it's that the prison populations tends to be a lot less then?
In strict Muslim countries, yeah. I don't know if I can find my cursor. Is it? It's over there, is it? Oh, there. Now which way should I go? That way? Yeah, well, thanks. A bit annoying, that, isn't it, really? Okay, so the content of Sharia. So it's a body of law. It's family law about divorce, marriage, inheritance, all these kinds of things. also national law, and that includes things about the status of non-Muslims. So within a Muslim country, non-Muslims have what's called a dhimmi status. So they're treated basically as second-class citizens, and they have to pay an extra tax. They don't have to, or even they're not allowed to fight in the army, but instead they have to pay an extra tax. And so people who, in theory, people who are religious, Jews and Christians who have a scripture and have a prophet, they're allowed to practice their religion, but they're not allowed to expand their religion. They're not allowed to witness to anybody. So people can convert to Islam, but Muslims are not allowed to convert. They're not allowed to become atheists. They're not allowed to become Christians or Jews or Hindus or anything else. So again, as a standard within Muslim countries, a person who converts from Islam is regarded as an apostate and will be put to death. Even Muslims in this country who convert to Christianity, they get hounded and abused by other Muslims in their community in this country, and they have to leave the town and go and live somewhere else in hiding. Changing them, So that's just the way it works. Also the body of law for international law, so it's very advanced, because Europe at this time didn't have this, wasn't as advanced as this. So the authority for law is the Quran, first of all. There are laws within the Quran. And the second authority for law is the Sunnah. So this is the life of the Prophet. So Muhammad then is regarded as a role model. So if Muhammad did it, then that was how one should live one's life. Yeah. So, based upon the way of the Prophet, the life of the Prophet, how he lived his life, this then becomes a way of deciding what is right and what is wrong, what is the law. And so the Sunnah then includes, two things. It includes the Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet. So the Quran is the first level of authority. Second level of authority are the Sunnah, which is partly the sayings of the Prophet, the Hadith, which are recorded, and also the practices of the Prophet, the sort of thing, the way he lived his life. And then, of course, that doesn't cover everything. And so there's certain schools of law where there'd be judges who would, basically they would look at a particular case and then pass a ruling. But that ruling wouldn't set a precedent. It's not like in English law, where when the judges make a ruling, that sets a precedent for the future. Every case is tried on its own merits, and there would be different judges, and they would develop some sort of consensus amongst the religious scholars about how the law should be applied. And so you have these different schools of law where these different things have been developed. And so this then led to a separation of powers. So the scholars, the judges, they would decide the law. So the ruler was very limited to the extent to which he was able to make laws. Yeah. So the rulers then in Muslim countries was very limited to the extent they could make law, because the law, what the law was decided by the religious scholars and not by the ruler. So you had that useful separation there. So another thing, any questions on Sharia? And so there are Sharia courts in most Muslim countries, to some extent or another, based upon Sharia. Most Muslims around the world want their societies to be completely governed by Sharia law, including most Muslims in Britain. They also want Britain to be governed by Sharia law. And they want Sharia law to be incorporated into English law. At the moment, there are Sharia courts in England. These are based upon the law of arbitration, where you can have, which exists within industrial relations and things. And so these Sharia courts, if the people accept the authority of the Sharia court in this country, then their Sharia court can make a ruling about different things. And so particularly it works in family law. And so a lot of Muslims then they try and base their family life upon family law. And of course one of the rules is that Muslim men are allowed to divorce their wives, just by saying 3 times, over a certain period of time, I divorce you. So there's a tendency then within Britain for Muslims not to have a civil marriage. Because if you have a civil marriage, then of course you have the rights that go along with a civil marriage. And if you want to get divorced, you have to get divorced in a court of law, which means that the judge will decide how things are, what happens. Whereas if you don't have a civil marriage, then you have no rights under English law. And then you have certain rights under Muslim law. So it's very quite, tricky situation. What's jihad? So again, literally, the jihad means a struggle in the way of Allah. And so the purpose of jihad is to establish peace. So it's a struggle that's necessary in order to establish peace. So the meaning of jihad has different meanings. One meaning, what Muhammad himself called the greater jihad, is the religious life. So through living and following these 5 pillars of faith, through praying 5 times a day, through doing charity, going on Hajj and fasting, this is a religious life in which one is having to challenge one's fallen nature. One's having to struggle to become a better person. And so here the idea is that before you try and change society, you should try and change yourself. So this jihad is to improve yourself and to perfect yourself, and on that basis then you can go out and you can transform and change society. There's also what's often called the lesser jihad. So this is a struggle to remove evil and injustice in the world. So the first stage is you should speak out against injustice, and then another thing which you should do, another obligation, is to defend Islam from attack. And so again, when something happens, for example, when some cartoons are published of the Prophet Muhammad, then there's rioting all over the world, and Muslims saw themselves as this is the way in which they could defend Islam. And so to insult the Prophet Muhammad is regarded as blasphemous and a serious crime from a Muslim point of view. People get killed quite easily because of this if they do that, or perceived to be doing this. So the jihad to defend Islam from attack, and so that becomes justification for all sorts of things going on, such as 9/11 and Al-Qaeda and all these sorts of terrorist attacks. Also, jihad is a way of spreading Islam by creating an environment where it's easier to convert people. So after Muhammad died, and then Islam spread very, very rapidly by Arab armies throughout the Middle East, throughout North Africa, into Spain, and then into Byzantium, which is now called Turkey. And so it wasn't that people were forced to convert to Islam, but that by conquering these countries and establishing an Islamic state, then it made it much easier for people to convert, and so lots of missionaries went out to convert people. This is, people who were Jews or Christians were converted to Islam. People who weren't Jews or Christians, if they were just pagans or atheists and they didn't have any spiritual or any religion, they were given a choice of either converting to Islam or being put to death. And that's still the way it is today. And so a lot of these things, which you might think, well, okay, that was the way it was 1,000 years ago, but these basic principles haven't changed until today. And you can see in ISIS, this sort of extremity there of what they've been doing. It's very, very extreme. Well, not extreme, it's just putting these ideas into practice, really. And then a mujahid is a person who dies doing jihad, so it's a martyr. So if a person is going on jihad and is killed fighting on this jihad, then they have a status of being a martyr, and they will go to heaven. So technically, when can war be called a jihad? So first of all, it has to be started by a religious leader. It's not supposed to be started by a political leader as such, but a religious leader. Then it has to have the backing of the Ummah, that's the Muslim community. It should also be defensive, but again, how do you define being defensive? Lots of things which, one looks like they're aggressive can be reconstrued as being defensive. It should also only be conducted after peaceful means have been exhausted. It's not allowed to be done to gain converts. Religious sites should be protected. Innocent people should not be put at risk, not to gain land or power, and the environment protected. Anyway, this is all in theory. Now, the practice, of course, as you see what's going on in the Middle East today is very, very different. In terms of religious sites being protected, you can see the Shia and the Sunni, especially the Sunni, attacking and blowing up many Shia mosques. Just the other day, this sort of thing happens, and destroying churches. Innocent people not at risk. Well, again, depends on how you define someone as innocent. If you say, well, this person, is a pagan, doesn't believe in God, or has a strange view of Islam, then they're not innocent, they're apostates, and they can be put to death. So the theory looks nice, but then, it's all in the small print. How you define these categories. It's just the way it is. But yeah, the theory is good. So in Christianity, there's an analog, a similar thing. It's called the theory of the just war. When is war justified? It's because, Christians have the theory of the just war, doesn't mean that they always keep to it, as you can see from much of Christian history. Just because Muslims also have this doctrine of jihad and when it's allowed, doesn't mean that they also always keep to it either. Okay, so the major divide you see at the moment is in the Muslim world is between the Sunni and the Shia. And this goes all the way back to the very, very beginnings of Islam. And it's a division, and I said last time that there are divisions, basically lots of the ideas and practices are the same, but basically it's a division about who should be in charge, who should be the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And so when Muhammad died, there were about 100,000 Muslims, and they were organized into a single Islamic state on the peninsula of Arabia, which is quite a bit bigger than Europe as far as I remember. A lot of it's desert, of course, sand. So the question was, well, who should succeed the Prophet and who should lead the Islamic State? So at that time, if you remember, the Prophet Muhammad, he was living in Medina. Originally he came from Mecca, and his oldest companions and followers, they came from Mecca. But then they had to emigrate, basically at the risk of their life, they emigrated and went to live in Medina. And then there were people in Medina who converted. And so within Medina, there were two groups of Muslims. There were the people who were from Medina and the people who were from Mecca. And so then the people from Medina, they decided after, I think a day or 2 days after the Prophet died, they were having a meeting, the ones from Medina, about who's going to be in charge and about electing somebody or appointing somebody from their community to be in charge. And then when Abu Bakr, who's and some of the people from Mecca heard about this, they went along and challenged them, because they thought it should be somebody from his oldest companions who came from Mecca who should be in charge. And so you had this division right at the very, very beginning. And so at this meeting, then Abu Bakr went along and someone called Umar, who talked them into accepting Abu Bakr to be the leader. So Abu Bakr, he was one of Muhammad's very, very first followers and companions, and so he became the leader. But then there was another group who thought that was wrong. So Muhammad had a son-in-law called Ali, who was his cousin, who was also one of the first followers, Ali, and he was married to one of Muhammad's daughters, Fatima, and so he thought that, and the family thought that he should be the successor to Muhammad. And so initially he didn't accept the legitimacy of Abu Bakr being the prophet, and so right at the very beginning this split started to develop. And then to avoid the split going any further, then Ali said, okay, I accept Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the successor to the prophet. And then what happened next is that, so basically the Shia then, they believe that Ali should have been the next prophet, not prophet, the caliph, the leader, whereas the Sunni believe it should have been Abu Bakr. And so both of them have got sort of evidence to support them. So the Sunnis, they argue that the Prophet Muhammad chose Abu Bakr to lead the congregational prayers as he lay on his deathbed, suggesting that he was to be the next leader. Now Shia, on the other hand, they say that Muhammad stood up in front of everybody, his companions, on the way back from the last Hajj, and he proclaimed Ali to the spiritual guide and master of all believers. And so that anybody who followed Muhammad should follow Ali. So you got these two different stories here. And anyway, so Abu Bakr, he became the first caliph then. And then, let's see what happens next. Yeah, then after he died, then the second caliph, he was Umar. So he was the one who went with Abu Bakr to persuade the Muslims in Medina to accept Abu Bakr. And so when Abu Bakr died, then Umar became the next caliph. He was originally one of the leading opponents to Muhammad and wanted to have Muhammad killed. But then later he converted and became a very strong Muslim. He came from a very wealthy and important family.
But like Paul.
Except he converted while Muhammad was still alive.
Oh, yeah.
So you remember Muhammad had to flee for his life.
Yeah.
So Umar then was one of the people who wanted Muhammad to be killed at that time. But then later on, he was actually on his way to kill him or something. Then he met his best friend, and his best friend had converted to Islam. And so then he went to see his best friend, his wife, in a big argument. And then he read a passage from the Quran and he was converted, became a Muslim. And then he went to see Muhammad and offered his sword to Muhammad, and he became one of the sort of warriors in the early days. Anyway, so he was the second caliph. And then when he died, he said the next caliph should be chosen amongst a group of... Oh, hi. You're going to have to correct me all the way here. I'm trying to explain about the Sunni-Shia split. You could probably explain this a lot better than me. Anyway.
You caused it.
Sorry? That's right, you caused it. Anyway, so we got to the third caliph here. And so the second caliph was Umar. Then he decided the next one, but was someone called Uthman. And so he was chosen from 6 candidates that were nominated by Umar. And then Umar himself was assassinated. And so there's a lot of politicking going on here. So Muhammad's wife Aisha was intensely involved in a lot of this, and lots of the companions, a huge amount of division and politicking and fighting going on. Anyway, so Umar then was not very popular, and some people climbed into his house and they assassinated him and they chopped him up into pieces, really unpleasant. And then Ali was not happy about this and was one of the people involved in trying to protect him. But anyway, then Ali then was chosen as the 4th caliph after the murder of Uthman. And so he was, as I said, he was the cousin of Muhammad and also his son-in-law, because he married one of his daughters. And so he moved the capital of the Islamic State from Medina to Kufa in Iraq. But his caliphate was opposed by Aisha, the favored wife of the Prophet, and the daughter of Abu Bakr. And she accused Ali of being lax and not making enough effort to bring Uthman's killers to justice, although in fact Uthman's killers were all killed anyway, shortly after they killed Uthman. And so this led to dispute and to battle, and Aisha was defeated here, and she later apologized to Ali, but by now the community had been seriously divided. And then the governor of Damascus, somebody called Muawiyah, he's very angry with Ali for not bringing the killers of his kinsman Uthman to justice, so he challenged Ali for the caliphate. There's a famous battle in 657 of Siffin, and Muawiyah's soldiers, they tied bits of the Quran, verses of the Quran to their spears, and Ali and his supporters felt morally unable to fight their Muslim brothers, and so the battle was indecisive, and they decided to settle the argument, through arbitration instead of through war. And then there was another sect. Sorry? It is very confusing. It's really confusing. All I can say is, there was a huge amount, the companions of Muhammad, there was a lot of rivalry, that's all I can say, between the companions, but also with the family. So Muhammad's youngest wife, who was a daughter of Abu Bakr, was, basically wanted that family to, Abu Bakr's family. She supported him, and she was against Ali, who of course was married to one of Muhammad's daughters. So it was an intense struggle within the family over the succession, who's going to be in charge. And there was a huge amount of bloodshed, and there were battles, and people were getting assassinated, murdered, for this. There's another group called how do you pronounce this? Kharijites? Kharijites, thank you.
I told you.
Anyway, Kharijites, they formed their own sect, and they opposed all the contenders of the caliphate, and then 661 they killed Ali while he's praying in the mosque. And then, they were defeated in a series of uprisings. And there's still about 500,000 of them surviving in different parts of North Africa and Zanzibar. And then after Ali was assassinated, then Muawiyah, he became the next caliph, and he moved the capital from Kufa in Iraq to Damascus. And this began the beginnings of the Umayyad dynasty, which went on for a long, long time. And at this time, then Islam expanded hugely. So this struggle then, a very bitter, bitter struggle, still going on until today. And then actually, I should carry on a bit more. And so Muawiyah then, he was very monarchical, and after he died, he was succeeded by his son Yazid. But the people of Kufa, he was succeeded by his son Yazid. And then Hussein, who was the son of Ali, was the son of Ali, he set off from Kufa from his home in Medina, and then he's met by Yazid's forces in Karbala before he got to his destination. But despite being hopelessly outnumbered, Hussein and his small number of companions refused to pay any allegiance to Yazid. They wouldn't recognize that he was the legitimate caliph, and so they were killed. And Hussein was killed and said to sacrifice his life for the survival of Shia Islam. And so from that time then, the Shia community then, they trace this line of imams or leaders. I think there's 12 directly from the Prophet's family. There's 12 altogether. And there's a 13th that sort of became the hidden imam, disappeared. Whereas the Sunni, then they went a very, very different line on the people who they regard as being, they would say, as the most professional, the most qualified from a professional point of view, I guess. And so, this is a very typical kind of struggle I think all religious movements go through. The early Christian church went through a similar kind of struggle. Who was the head of the Christian church following the death of Jesus?
Peter.
No. Who was the head of the church in Jerusalem? No. Not Paul.
Barnabas.
No. It was James, the brother of Jesus. That's what it says in the book of Acts. The brother of Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, became the head of the church, the Christian church, in Jerusalem. And then Peter is one of his, one of the pillars. So Paul was outside the Jerusalem church, and so you had this huge struggle for who should be the leader. So Paul said, "Well, I'm not a member of the family. I'm not even one of the disciples. So he based his leadership on this personal encounter he had with the resurrected Jesus. And he claimed in his letters to be a super apostle, etc., etc. So again, you had that conflict there. And then James was killed. Was he? Yeah. He was killed. Not just, disciples also, he was killed. And then by the early Christian tradition, it's understood that the whole of Jesus' family were wiped out during the revolt against Rome. So in 70 AD, when the revolt against the Roman Empire, then Jesus' family were wiped out.
It's a sort of an obvious thing, but surely early Christians and early Muslims could see that all this killing was surely against God's law.
Okay, so James, the brother of Jesus, he wasn't killed by the Christian church.
That's all right.
Yes, that's all right. that was anyway. Yeah.
No, but all the Islamic killings, early killings.
It was really very, very political, very, very messy.
Yeah.
Intensely.
But they couldn't sort of turn and say, well, wait a minute, chaps, we're kind of killing people off.
Yes.
Maybe that's against our own law.
Well, some did. So that's why Ali, for example, he was very, ambivalent about the battle, and said, "Oh well, he didn't like the idea of Muslims killing Muslims." But there are others that did. But you can see it's still going on today. It's Sunni and Shia, these are Muslims killing Muslims. I mean, in terms of suicide bombing, all this stuff, most Muslims are killed by Muslims, not by Jews or Christians. It's Muslims killing Muslims all the time, generally speaking. Very, very intense. And a lot of it, as I said, it's about who is the true Islam. What is the real Islam? Is it the Sunni one or is it the Shia? Who should really be in charge? So it's basically politics, very intense politics, with a religious dimension, which of course gives it a certain level of fanaticism, which means this struggle carries on for 1,000 years. Whereas when it's just ordinary politics, after a while people say, well, let's stop. And you can see it in Ireland, because of the religious dimension, it made it worse than if it's just a national thing. When we got the Scottish-English thing's been going on for 1,000 years, but they're not killing each other anymore. That's. I mean, yes. I mean, you know what I mean. The sting has been taken out of it. But when you have this, when it's not just a national thing, but also a religious thing, you get two dimensions of difference, and it becomes much more intense. And so the Shia-Sunni thing, it's not just Shia-Sunni, it's also Persian-Arab as well. So you got that extra dimension as well. So like in Northern Ireland, it wasn't just Catholic Protestant, it was also an ethnic difference as well. So if it's just religious, it's one thing, but when you get the ethnic piled on top of the religious, then it's very, very difficult to make, to cross those boundaries.
There's a matter of interest with them. When it comes to pilgrimage, the both Shia and Sunni, both of them can go. They usually they're not fights in the pilgrimage to Mecca. Both of them can both sects can go without any problem. And they can all supposed to worship in different ways, and then when they go to Mecca,
well, they all dress the same, don't they? They're all in ihram. They're all in completely white. They're not distinguishable from each other, and they're all, So up until now, it hasn't been an issue. And so as I said, that's what's going on at the moment, and it's been carrying on for a long, long time. And then, you look at our own movement as well, you can see, well, what's going on. Again, you got different struggles within the family, but also you have the institution. You know what I mean? So here you can see within Islam, there's the struggles within the family, but then you had the people who are not in the family who thought, well, where do we fit in? It's like what role does the institution have? Does authority lie just in the family? Or should authority lie in an institution representing all the believers? in a more of a meritocratic sense in that sense. So the different kind of competing, I can't say one is right and one is wrong, they're just different visions of how a community should be organized and where legitimate authority lies. And, you know, how do you fit them all together? Difficult, isn't it? So how can you fit these things together? I mean, it's possible.
With the flu.
Sorry?
With the flu.
By everybody getting flu?
Forgive, love, unite.
Sorry?
Forgive, love, unite.
Oh, forgive, love and unite. You can do that, but at the end of the day, you can do that, but at the end of the day, you have to have a practical structures. Otherwise, it's, you know.
That's where you come in.
Well, okay, so, I mean, as I said, there are these different things. You got the sort of family thing, okay, that's one aspect. Then you got the wider community. So how do you fit these things in? I mean, if you look at England, for example, it managed to do it quite well. So we have a royal family. So you got the lineage. The head of state is passed on through the lineage. But just because you happen to be the king or queen doesn't mean you're in charge of everything. Because there's also a House of Lords and the House of Commons. So everybody is represented and involved in the decision making through election in Parliament, etc., etc. So you got the lineage thing. So the problem comes when you think that there should be one leader who should be in charge of everything. Then of course it becomes a struggle. If on the other hand you're willing to say, okay, this person is the leader, but what they can do is severely restricted, and the powers have to be devolved to other things, then it's manageable. But when you just want to have one person at the charge, making all the decisions, then everybody else gets out. So, you know, obviously they weren't able to work it out in the early days in Islam, and so it split. But what's happened here? What should I do? Oh, back again. Okay. So, you know, one possibility would be for it to have gone through the family, but then, you know, lots of the more practical things being done by other people other than direct family members. But, you know, it's intensely political. You know, this early division between the Muslims from Medina and Mecca, that was that early division there, with both groups wanting to be in charge. And then, you know, the reality situation when Ali felt should have been involved in this meeting as well. But, you know, the urgent time, Umar and Abu went, and so it's very, very complicated. And, anyway, it's lots to learn here, how not things. I don't know if people learn lessons from this start anyway. Or sometimes they just learn them. But yeah, as I said, you know, human nature is human nature. Every spiritual, every organization, religious and otherwise, goes through these kind of things, these kind of issues, and has to resolve them. Unfortunately, in the early days of Islam, they weren't able to do it. But even when you have businesses, you know, I was just reading just in the newspaper the other day, there's one fund manager, a very successful fund manager. He started his own fund, investment fund, one of these hedge funds, and was doing really well. But then he got kicked out by the other people who were directors. They didn't like his style anymore. So even though he started the whole thing, they decided to get rid of him. So, you know, this is just the way the world works. It's just human nature. One has to try and negotiate. So what's going on in our own movement? It's nothing unusual. It's just normal. The question is whether we can resolve these things or not, or just repeat, you know, the same sort of things. Because right at the, you know, you just get these little things right at the very, very beginning there, the first few days after the death of Muhammad, the results of those are still here today. That's what's going on in the Middle East today. Yeah? So just some small little mistake right at the very beginning. The same when you get married, you know, if you make a little mistake when you're first getting married, then, you know, it can easily build up. And it's very, very, one has to be very, very careful in the early days of everything, actually, to make sure it starts off on the right footing. because it starts off on the wrong footing and then it just gets magnified. Anyway, so there's one empire after another. So the first one, as I said, why is it doing this? The first one was established there in Damascus, and it spread very, very rapidly, the Umayyad dynasty. Help. Doing very well here. Need to practice it. Where's my cursor? It's over there. Okay. And later spread into Spain. We'll look at that a little bit. And then it was succeeded by the Abbasid dynasty. So I'll try and see if I can find out about this. A bit later on. And then by the Ottoman Empire, then, which lasted until very recently, then by the Safavid dynasty, which is another thing which I'm sure Farha can tell us all about. So the Umayyad dynasty, this was Sunni Arab, the capital was in Damascus, and it led to the huge expansion through the Middle East and into North Africa, and it continued into Spain up until the 11th century. And you can see here a couple of these buildings from Spain. And it's a very, very successful. That's the Alhambra. And then one of the things happened, Caliph Umar, he conquered Palestine, Jerusalem from the Byzantines. So at this time it was all part of the Byzantine Empire, which was the sort of continuation of the Roman Empire. And so he went into Jerusalem, and he built the Al-Aksa Mosque. So when he went into Jerusalem, he went up to the Temple Mount, and the Christians at that time were using the Temple Mount as a rubbish dump. So he cleared off the rubbish, and then he built a mosque, the Al-Aksa Mosque, at one end of the Temple Mount, and then some years later built the Dome of the Rock on top of the rock that Abraham's supposed to sacrifice Isaac, or the binding of Isaac, and the rock from which Muhammad went into the spiritual world to lead the prophets in prayer to see God. And then he also opened up the Jerusalem and allowed Jewish and Christian pilgrims to freely visit the holy sites. So up until then, Jews hadn't been allowed to go to Jerusalem to the holy sites, but then he allowed Jews to freely go there. And so here's the Al-Aksa Mosque. So I think it's the third most holy site within Islam. Second, third, depends if you're Shia or Sunni, I suppose. Fourth. I think it's the third, after Mecca, Medina, and then the Al-Aksa Mosque. And by tradition, Muhammad went there. It's not built on the site of the temple, it's built on the Temple Mount. Okay, this is how the Islamic Empire expanded. So, it started off right down there. In Muhammad's lifetime, what is this arrow? I'm trying to get it over here. So this is during the lifetime. Muhammad is able to unite all the Arab tribes into an Islamic state. This is Mecca here, this is Medina. Then after he died, Islam expanded very, very rapidly with Umar. After Abu Bakr, then Umar, second caliph, conquered Jerusalem and this whole area here. And it rapidly expanded. I can't quite read what it says. There's up until the expansion is incredibly rapid. Okay, so this is under Muhammad. This little bit here. This is the territory added by the first four caliphs between 632 and 661. So this whole area in yellow was added under the first 4 caliphs, huge. And then under the Umayyad caliphs, that was when, after it was moved to Damascus, this whole area here, the Maghreb and Spain, and here into Afghanistan and the border with India. And so this bit here is not Muslim. So in a space of 130 years, that was that rapid expansion. Yeah? And it hasn't gone back. It's, so it's incredibly rapid. So supposing you're sitting here in Rome, watching what goes on, how do you feel? Yeah, feel threatened. So all these lands here throughout the Middle East and North Africa, what religion were the people there before the Islamic Empire expanded into that area? They were Christians, yeah. The whole of the Middle East, they were Christians or Jews, and North Africa.
Turkey was Christian.
Well, it's Byzantine Orthodox, yes. The whole area there, this was Egypt was Copt. And this area here, there were Nestorians. There's a huge church based in Baghdad. Today you still get these remnants of these Syrian Orthodox Christians, many different ancient old Christian churches which still exist and being preserved almost as relics. Yeah, so if you're sitting in Europe and you see this incredibly rapid expansion and conquest of Christian countries and Christian lands in a space of 130 years, kind of scary. And so that is the sort of roots of this word Islamophobia. It's fear of Islam. It's fear of Islam conquering all the Christian countries and then going into what's now called Turkey and the fall of Byzantium, the fall of Constantinople, San Sophia, the largest Christian church in the world, I think, being made into a mosque. And then Islam expanding later on under the Ottomans into Eastern Europe. So that's the roots, the sort of European roots of this sort of fear of Islam. Comes from there. Huge shock. Anyway, so expanded into France, and then they're defeated in 732 by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. Poitiers? No, that's when the English trashed the French. The Battle of Tours was when Charles Martel defeated the Muslims in 732. Battle of Tours, yeah. And so the Muslim, one implication of Muslim Sharia law is a concept of waqf. W-A-Q-F, how do you pronounce that? Waqf. Yeah. So any land conquered by Muslims is consecrated and then always becomes Muslim, can never go back. And so if you listen to people like Osama bin Laden when he was alive, he used to talk about Spain as a Muslim land which had been conquered. So from his perspective, Spain should still be Muslim. Because it had been Muslim, then it should still be Muslim. And so he wouldn't call it Spain, he used to call it Al-Andalus. Yeah. So that's, I think that sort of also is connected to this whole thing about the Jewish state, Israel. It's not the fact that there are Jews living there, the fact it's not under Muslim control, which is the issue, because of this doctrine of waqf. And then you had the Abbasid dynasty. This was a reaction to Arab domination. So a lot of people then who converted to Islam, they weren't Arabs, but the Quran was written in Arabic, and so the general sort of tendency to talk about Arab cultural imperialism and the loss of or denigration of existing languages and existing histories and existing literature and everything, and its replacement by Arabic. So it's particularly the case, I would say, it's all my opinion of course, in Persia, which had a very, very ancient language and culture and literature of its own, which was pre-Islamic. Whereas though, as far as I understand the Arab world, there was no written culture or language until the Quran appeared. And so everything then from all Arabic culture is based upon the Quran. Whereas though I would say, in Persia, that's one aspect of the culture, but they're also a much more ancient culture as well. Anyway, so the Abbasids, this was a third of these caliphates, and descended from Muhammad's youngest uncle, Abbas, and they ruled with their capital in Baghdad. So it was a mixture of Arab and Persians, mixture of Sunni and Shia, but they were rather weak, and so power then became fractured amongst the different regional dynasties, and this dynasty ended with the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols, and that was a huge cultural disaster, really. And then, as I said, they were becoming weak, and so you had a new dynasty emerged in Egypt, 969. And they were Sunnis. Now, the Fatimid caliphs, they were Ismailis, opposed to the Sunnis in Baghdad. And the person who is really complicated, someone called Al-Hakim bi Amra. So, he was the ruler. Is generally understood to be a little bit odd, and some people called him mad, and he thought that, or his followers thought that he was the incarnation of God, and then he was disappeared. Nobody understands what happened to him. He was disappeared, and later on the Druze proclaimed him as their founder. But anyway, one of the things that he did was he destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in 1009. So that's the church where it's believed that Jesus was buried and resurrected, and went around sacking and destroying quite a few churches in Palestine. And so this, of course, annoyed Christians because, in Europe. And then the Seljuk Turks, they, moving up through Turkey, coming from Central Asia, moving into Byzantium, they defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and they seized Anatolia, which is now called Turkey. And this threatened the Christian pilgrim routes. And so a lot of Christians in Europe became very concerned about this, and so the Pope preached a crusade to retake Jerusalem and protect pilgrims. As Pope Urban II, he preached this crusade. And so these Fatimids then, they sort of still exist. Have you heard of the Ismailis? It's a very small sect of Shia, and very, very wealthy. And the leader is the Aga Khan. Yeah. So have you heard of the Aga Khan?
Yes.
He's very, very wealthy.
Ismaili Muslims.
That's right, and he's very wealthy, race horses and things. Yes, and quite a lot of them, I think, in East Africa, as far as I remember. And anyway, so they're the descendants of this particular group. Anyway, so the 9 Crusades, Jerusalem's captured, 1099, population were massacred by the Crusaders. They didn't discriminate between Jews, Christians and Muslims, they were all put to the sword. And then Saladin, who was a general, he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. And then, sorry?
I don't know.
He was a general. He wasn't the caliph. He was a particularly capable general.
I just remember that name from something in the 60s on TV.
Okay. He's the one who, he met Francis of Assisi. Do you remember that? This is the time St. Francis of Assisi. This is Francis was a peace-loving person, so he thought he'd go off and make peace in the Middle East. And so he went along, as far as I remember, he met Saladin and they got on very well together. But, lots of these sort of things. Anyway, so the Crusader rule then ended in Syria, 1291, and Constantinople itself was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. So this period of the Crusaders didn't last for very long, actually, just a couple of hundred years, relatively short. Then the Ottomans, this is the Ottoman Empire, expanded through this area here, based in Turkey, Central Asia. This is what's now called Armenia, what's now called Georgia, and then this whole area here of Eastern Europe, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, this whole area right up as far as Vienna. So twice they laid siege to the city of Vienna, and they were defeated. The second time they were defeated by a Polish king who came to the rescue. So Hungary, all this area then was under Ottoman control until until relatively recently, till about 19th century, I think. When were the Ottomans pushed back out of Hungary? Basically, it sort of gradually started to be pushed. It was 17th century that they were defeated at Vienna. So from that point, gradually they were pushed out, and it wasn't until the end of the First World War, really, that these areas were completely liberated. And so this is under Suleiman the Magnificent. So a huge empire. And if you look at Islam today, the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, in terms of the most populous. Then the whole of North Africa, the Middle East, up to Turkey, vast amounts of through Central Asia, all these are the stans, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. Then India is the country with the largest number of Muslims living in it. And and so you can see it moving south here, and so you got a lot of conflicts now in Nigeria, where quite a few of the northern states have adopted Sharia law. So people who commit adultery are stoned to death, etc. So it's Islam then moving south, and so you get lots of conflict zones in the Sudan, and then throughout this whole area here. And also in China, this area here is also part of China, so there's large Muslim communities there, and again you get the rise of Islamic fundamentalism there as well, in Bangladesh, Pakistan. Okay. And so how does 9/11 fit in? It's interesting. What? I don't know how that got there. I don't know how to get rid of it either. It happened once before. How do you get rid of it?
What is it, Wikipedia?
Is there a thing I can click on here to get rid of it? I don't know how to get rid of it.
Where do you minimize everything over here?
What's this down here? It's still there, annoying. Don't know how to get, it happened once before, I don't know how to get rid of it.
Click it or something.
Sorry?
I don't know.
There's something.
Right click.
Yeah, that works.
Right click, I don't.
And then see if it's
If you click on
that on the actual thing.
Let's try and start again. Let's see if we can start again. Okay, there we are. All right, so this is Osama bin Laden. It's very interesting to know what's Osama bin Laden's justification, theological or religious justification for 9/11, what he was doing. It's quite interesting because he quotes, the Quran. So this is his justification. Not all Muslims obviously accept it, but quite a significant proportion have some, sympathy for it. So permission to fight against disbelievers is given to those believers who are fought against, because they've been wronged, and surely Allah is able to give them, the believers, victory. So this is his, everything's based upon the Quran. So this is his verse from the Quran that he bases his whole approach on. So you can fight against disbelievers if the believers have been wronged. So you can fight against anybody who's wronged you. So the point then is that Osama bin Laden has to justify and give evidence to say, yes, the Muslim believers have been wronged, therefore we can fight against the disbelievers. And so that's then what he does. So why are we fighting and opposing you? So he says, because you attacked us. we didn't attack you, you attacked us. And so for Muslims, I said, the dominant category is the Ummah. It's not the country, it's the Ummah, which is the whole Muslim community, worldwide Muslim community. So if one part of the Muslim community gets attacked, over here in one part of the world, it's as if Muslims all over the world were attacked, and they should all react and respond to this. So of course he says you attacked us in Palestine, so you got this whole issue in the Middle East, Somalia, that's when the Americans went into Somalia. He also said you support governments which oppress us, Saddam Hussein. You support the Jews in their false claim to Israel, so again Muslims reject the Jewish claim to the land of Israel, because they said it's not valid. You steal oil at low prices, so the idea here that Western oil companies went into the Middle East and they extracted oil without paying for it at the proper price. Because of you, lots of Iraqi children are starving. You have to remember this is some years ago now, 12 years ago. There'll be a lot more things to add. So he said, we have the right to resist against your attack. Then the United States of America is a democracy. So since because it's a democracy, it means you elected and you voted in the government. That means there are no innocent civilians because the government represents the American people. So people said, well, it's wrong to attack office workers. They're innocent, they're not soldiers. So his argument, well, it's a democracy, so anybody who elected the American government is like a soldier. And so nobody's innocent. And also, everybody's taxes are used to fund the military. So that means, anybody can be attacked. There's no such thing as an innocent civilian anymore. Okay, so this is Osama bin Laden's next question. What are we calling you to, and what do we want from you? The first thing that we're calling you to is Islam. So he said the religion of the unification of God, sincerity, so yeah, this radical monotheism, sincerity, the best of manners, righteousness, mercy, honor, purity, and piety. So this is how he characterizes Islam. He says Islam is a religion of showing kindness to others, establishing justice between them, granting them their rights, and defending the oppressed and the persecuted. So this is the basic stance. We're inviting you and calling you to become Muslims. If you reject this, then we have the right to put you to the sword. You understand? So he's saying, we invited you all to become Muslims, because if you rejected this invitation, then you are disbelievers and you can be put to the sword. The second thing we're calling you to is to stop your oppression, lies, immorality, and debauchery that is spread among you. So the examples here, we call on you to be a people of manners, principles, honor, and purity, to reject the immoral acts of fornication, homosexuality, intoxicants, alcohol, gambling, and trading with interest, that's banking. And so one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Al-Qaeda somehow connected, was a scholar whose name I forget, who went to America, I think in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. Okay, and he was from Egypt, and he went to America, and he was, as a student, to study, and he was really shocked when he saw men and women dancing together, and this and this and this. He was really shocked, and he regarded American society as totally debauched and immoral, and he started this huge anti-Western kind of thing within the Muslim world. Up until that time, Muslims hadn't really noticed America, because America hadn't really appeared anywhere.
Maybe Banna was his family name?
I think so, I can't remember now. I think the Egyptians put him to death and they executed him. So when he went back to Egypt, he's arrested, because he's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was executed. Anyway, he said you invent your own laws. So from Muslims then, the Sharia, is divinely revealed. So they say, well, human beings sitting in a parliament or a congress don't have the authority to make new laws, don't have the authority to say homosexuality is okay. You're not allowed to invent own laws. He said, exploit women, prostitution, created the atom bomb, and you're just a bunch of hypocrites. So, Osama bin Laden said, we call upon you, thirdly, to take on an honest stance with yourselves, that we advise you to stop supporting Israel. We advise you to pack your luggage and get out of our lands. So after the first Gulf War, there were a lot of American troops and armaments that were based in Saudi Arabia, I think, weren't they? I think, and so they regarded this as, as wrong, and somehow, blasphemous or something. Anyway, you should get out of the Middle East. Sixthly, we call upon you to end your support of the corrupt leaders in our countries, Saddam Hussein and people like this, Assad. We also call upon you to deal with us and interact with us on the basis of mutual interests and benefits. So that was his justification for the 9/11, for all the different terrorist activities. So you can say from their point of view it's grounded and rooted in the Quran and a particular interpretation and application of Islamic law or Sharia. So I said, not all Muslims would accept that, but when you look at what's going on, you can see, there is quite a lot of support for this particular interpretation of Islam and the violence that goes along with it. In terms of Muslim contributions to the world, they've been extraordinary. So one of the greatnesses, I think, of the early Islamic world is that they learned and inherited and built upon the knowledge from Greece and India. So Muhammad said, if you have to go to China to pursue knowledge. Muhammad himself, the Quran itself, is very open to knowledge, very open to ideas from other places. And so although, in Arabia at the time, there was very little in terms of knowledge, etc., when they conquered these other countries, they thought, wow, these people got better buildings than us, they got more knowledge than us, we want some of this. And so a lot of the mosques that were built, they were built by Christian, Greek architects, based upon, Roman and Greek technology. And so the Arabs, the Muslims, then they inherited all this knowledge from Greece and also from India. So, for example, these numbers that we use today, they're called Arabic numerals, compared to Roman numerals, which were, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1V. And you can see here how these Arabic numerals, so you can see the 2, for example, the 1 is obvious, just a straight line, the 2's 2 lines, and it's been turned on its side. The 3 is 1, 2, 3, and it's been turned on its side. And so, I can't see how the other ones work except for the 9. And the idea of 0 was also introduced, so the Romans knew nothing about 0 or the Greeks. So this is inherited by Muslims from India, where Indian mathematicians had come up with the idea of a 0, and the Arabs spread this mathematics to Europe. And so Europe then inherited mathematics from the Muslim world. Science came, again, predominantly developed in the Muslim world. So even the vocabulary we have, chemistry, it's an Arabic word, alchemy, physics. These are Arabic words which we use. And so a lot of the Enlightenment and discoveries by European scientists, they based upon a lot of their work based upon translations from the Arabic, of the Arabic science textbooks. And they were able to inherit that and build upon that, and obviously overtake the Muslim world. Biology as well is highly developed in the Muslim world, horticulture, botany, far more developed in the Muslim world than it was in Europe, until the Europeans inherited this knowledge from the Islamic world. Mathematics, the word algebra is an Arabic word. As I said, all the numbers come from Arabic numbers. Other contributions, medicine, the standard textbooks of medicine were Arabic. I think it was in Tajikistan, they were doing all sorts of things. They had anesthetics, and they were doing all sorts of incredibly complex and sophisticated surgery. Where in Europe, if you became sick, they would just bleed you. If you went to an Arab hospital in Spain, they would cure you. They had medicine, they had anesthetics, they had disinfectants. They had much, much, much more advanced than Europe was until the Enlightenment. Then historiography, they wrote the histories, again, a long time before history started to be written seriously in Europe in the Enlightenment time. Commerce, trade was highly developed. They had the biggest libraries in the world. The first universities were in Muslim countries. In Morocco was the first university. art was extraordinarily beautiful. You know, these are Islamic tiles and some of the extraordinary calligraphy. What does that say? Any ideas? Okay, thank you.
I thought that's
You thought that sort of...
of course.
It's the beginning of every surah, the name of God.
But you can see, it's amazing what you can do with the Arabic script that you can't do with the Latin script in terms of extraordinarily beautiful calligraphy in all kinds of shapes and designs. It's out of this world.
But they read from opposite from.
They read from right to left?
Yeah.
Yeah, right to left, yeah. So beautiful. And yes, and of course, I mean, some stunning architects who built some incredibly beautiful buildings. And of course, the architect wasn't allowed to sign his name. And, it's all very anonymous. But there was one architect, he using calligraphy, he signed his name at the top of the door as you go in, but you could only read it using a mirror. And so he got away with it until somebody had a mirror and they looked back and they saw the name of the architect was there. So very, very creative in that way as well. Anyway, so the architecture was, again, extraordinarily beautiful. Europe sort of started catching up really in the Gothic times, the cathedrals and things, but a long time afterwards. And a lot of inventions, telescopes, pendulum, watches, all these things.
Pendulum?
Sorry?
Did they invent pendulum?
Well, that's what this book told me, yes. Amongst other things, lots of other things, for telling the time and working out the physics, the mathematics of how pendulums thing. So incredibly advanced, really.
But then it stopped somewhere.
What? The pendulum.
All those.
That's right.
All
That's.
those development.
You're quite right.
Where are the scholars?
Okay. Do you want? Okay. I have this. Do you want me to explain that? I can. If you just give me 1 minute, I just need to find the right presentation. I should have added it onto here really, but I haven't given this presentation for such a long time. You just give me a minute and I'll find it. That's really a very important question. And it explains 400 years. And that, all that. Sorry for getting tired. Okay, so just whiz through this. You might wonder, why wasn't the Messiah born in a Muslim country? Okay, so the rise of Islam, expansion of the Islamic Empire. So Messiah could have been born in a Muslim country. As I said, Muslims believe in Jesus. They believe Jesus is the prophet, they believe Jesus is the Messiah, they believe in the virgin birth, and they believe that Jesus will return at the last days to judge the world. So you might think, well, why wasn't the Messiah born in a Muslim country? It could have been born in a Messiah could have been born in a Muslim country. And 2,000 years ago, the future was open. God didn't know where the Messiah would come, because how is it decided where the Messiah is going to be born? Who decides where the Messiah is going to be born?
Whoever makes the foundation.
That's right, whoever makes a foundation to receive the Messiah. Does God know, 2,000 years ago, did God know who was going to make a foundation to receive the Messiah, or when they were going to make it? No, because we have free will and responsibility, and people make mistakes. So 2,000 years ago, there are lots of different possibilities for where the Messiah could come, and he could have been born in a Muslim country. So the question is, there has to be a foundation of faith, foundation of substance for that to happen. And the unity of Hebraism and Hellenism. And so you can see the Hebraic traditions, a spiritual culture based upon listening, free will, etc. Hellenistic culture is very different, a material culture based, emphasizing reason and science. And in the divine principle it says, but in principle it says, only when Cain-type Hellenism submits to Abel-type Hebraism can Satan be separated from the prevailing spirit of the age, then the foundation substance necessary for receiving Christ, the second advent, could be established. So that means when Hebraism and Hellenism are united, then that means the Messiah can be born. So these two different cultural streams, and the question is who's able to do that. So if we have a look at what happened in the Muslim world then, I talked about under the Umayyad dynasty, Islamic Spain, there was an incredible flowering of culture. It's one of the greatest periods in European history in terms of its cultural flowering. It's a golden age. And the Caliphate of Cordoba, it lasted for about 100 years. And it's a golden age of culture, science, art, architecture, philosophy, libraries, medicine, astronomy. The rest of Europe was at this time really in a miserable situation. Really in a miserable situation. Nothing comparable. These are the kind of buildings that were built in Spain at that time. So this here is the, what's it called again? The Alhambra. It's an extraordinary, beautiful, big mosque. Anyway, if you look up there, you can see what's that building stuck in the middle of it is a Christian church. So the Christians couldn't adapt to it, they didn't want to knock it down, so they decided to build a Christian church in the middle of this mosque. Anyway, it's the way it works. And at this time, Islamic Spain was relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians. And so incredible flowering of Jewish and Christian culture at this time in Spain as well. Maybe the Messiah could have come here, I think. But, maybe if... This is also a time of Charlemagne. Things didn't work out there. So, anyway, this time finished. So how did Islamic thought develop? Well, as I said, one of the greatest things of the Arabs is that when they came across something, they adopted it and made it their own. So Greek architecture, but also Greek philosophy. So one of the earliest of the Muslim philosophers, someone called Al-Farabi, a Turkic Persian, and he came across Aristotle. And so in Baghdad, during the Abbasid dynasty, vast amounts of books were translated from Greek by Christian Arabs into Arabic. So they could read the Greek and they translate into Arabic. So all the works of Greek philosophy and technology and all these books, geometry, they're all translated and published in Arabic. And then people like Al-Farabi studied this, and he said, revelation, the Quran, and philosophy, that's Aristotle, are two ways to the same truth. And so he sort of synthesized these two, synthesize the Islamic tradition based upon the Quran, plus the philosophy, the philosophical tradition coming from Greece, and bring these together. And so because of this, and the whole of Muslim culture is based upon this synthesis of the Hebraic and Hellenistic tradition. And you have this incredible flowering of Islamic culture, because they inherited everything from Greece. Then you had someone called Avicenna, who was from Uzbekistan, it's also in Central Asia, further east. So he was, an incredible polymath. He was a physician, an incredible doctor, wrote books on medicine. He was a philosopher and a scientist. And he also synthesized Islam and Aristotle. And so again, you had this continuation of this flowering of Islamic culture. And then you had someone called Al-Ghazali from Persia. He was also steeped in the Greek philosophy, but then he had some kind of religious experience. And he systematized Sufism, which is Muslim mysticism. And then he came up with a criticism of Avicenna. And he wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And he ended up rejecting Plato and Aristotle and the Greek tradition. And basically, and crudely, saying if it's not in the Quran, it's either not true or we don't need it. And so Al-Ghazali was one philosopher amongst many. And that was fine. The problem was his views became the dominant philosophical stance of the whole of the Muslim world up until today. And so in Spain, though, you continue to have this, this liberal, tolerant atmosphere, this development. And so you have someone called, I can never pronounce it, Averroes.
The origin was Ibn Rushd.
Ibn Rushd, okay, anyway, Ibn Rushd or various. And he was also, an incredible person, master of Aristotelian philosophy, of Islamic philosophy and theology. He was a doctor, a mathematician, a judge. He wrote down music theory, etc., etc. An astronomer, a geographer, an incredible polymath. And he's been described as the founding father of secular thought in Western Europe and one of the spiritual fathers of Europe. So the reason is, and he was also a commentator on Aristotle and Plato and sought to reconcile Islam and Aristotle. And then he came across Al-Ghazali's book and he wrote a critique of Al-Ghazali's book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. A typical philosopher, nice play on language. And, but the problem was, though, the ulema, they came out against him, and so he was exiled, and his books were burnt, and they were disowned by Islamic scholars. And that's a great tragedy. He wrote 67 original works, 28 works on philosophy, 20 books on medicine, 8 on law, 5 on theology, 4 on grammar, in addition to all his commentaries and, things on science and astronomy.
So he was Spanish.
Well, I don't know if he'd call him Spanish, but he was a Muslim living in Spain.
Yeah.
I
But he was not Spanish, so he was...
don't know how you define Spanish. It all depends. And so this is the problem then. So Hebraism then, a very strong Hebraic tradition, but they rejected Hellenism. And so as a result of this, a very limited religious freedom, then no foundation to see the Messiah. And from this point, gradually, I think, it started this gradual cultural, economic and political decline. And also becomes a basis for Islamic extremism. Because, the Islamic world was hundreds of years more advanced than the Christian world for a long, long time. But then Europe overtook it. And then Europe started to invade Muslim lands and countries. And so Muslims felt that's not the way it's supposed to be. We should have hegemony. These people are all supposed to be dhimmis. How come they've overtaken us? It's like a huge shock. This from which the Muslim world is trying to deal with. How is it possible, for this to have taken place? And then that's the sort of Islamic extremism you get as one of these, responses to this. Let's mention this briefly as well. Maimonides, he was a great Jewish thinker, also lived in Cordoba. At this time, then, the Almohades, which was a group from Muslim tribes from North Africa, they invaded Spain, and then from this point, it led to the decline of this golden age of Spain. And so Maimonides is a great thinker there, physician, philosopher, commentator on the Mishnah. So he learned from Ibn Rushd. So he read Ibn Rushd's works in Arabic, and he learned from that. And so he did a similar thing with Judaism, synthesizing Aristotle and the Torah based upon the approach of Ibn Rushd. And then his works then wrote something called Guide for the Perplexed, and lots of other things. His works became the basis for Orthodox Judaism up until today. So Judaism then synthesized Hebraism and Hellenism. So this is the basis for the Jewish contribution to world culture and civilization up until today, where they're so successful in every field they're involved with because of this synthesis. But because there's no national foundation, the Messiah couldn't be born Jewish. Then this is interesting. Thomas Aquinas then, a little bit after Ibn Rushd, philosopher, theologian, monk. So he called Ibn Rushd the great. He based him on Aristotle, but he regarded Ibn Rushd as the great philosopher or something. I can't remember the exact term, but basically he learnt from this Islamic scholarship from Arabic. And so then the Greek works were translated into Arabic, and then from the Arabic they translated back into Latin. So it's actually from Spain that the Western Europe received the Greek philosophy and the Greek culture, because the early Christian church destroyed and burned the books. the Greeks' textbooks and philosophers. So he established a medieval synthesis. This became the basis for Western Christianity and the incredible flowering of medieval Christianity. And Thomas Aquinas' thoughts are still the basis of Catholicism until today, Summa Theologica. And so that's why European Christianity then could establish a foundation to receive the Messiah by uniting the Hebraism and Hellenism together. So Islam did it, but then the synthesis broke. Judaism did it, but they had no national foundation. Whereas European Christianity is able to establish not just this, but also a political foundation. And so that's why yeah. Anyway, it's a long answer to your short question, I'm sorry.
It's quite a lot.
But it's interesting, if you apply the principle, it's really a very powerful analytical tool to answer those kind of questions. What went wrong? Well, you need to synthesize Hebraism and Hellenism. The Muslim world did that for a long period of time, but then, for various reasons, it broke up. It's not that Al-Ghazali was a bad person. He was a great philosopher, a profound philosopher, and a wonderful person. The only problem was that his philosophy became the dominant philosophy. It's a bit like the weakness you have in Western Christianity. Augustine was a great church father, but in Western Christianity he's the only one. Whereas the Orthodox Church has many church fathers. So it becomes very unbalanced. And the same, in Western Europe now we have many philosophers. You got Hume, who's, intense skeptic, and you got other ones who are incredibly religious. And that's fine when you've got all these different philosophers in discussion with each other. It only becomes a problem when a country or a culture adopts one philosopher and eliminates all the others. And then it becomes problematic. So Al-Ghazali was a great man, a great philosopher, a great thinker. The only problem was that the Muslim world took him as being the one. And then the other philosophers like Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Farabi, all these other ones, and with that, Aristotle and Plato were all just denigrated, and then you ended up with incredible narrowness and extremism. Anyway, prattled on far too long, so there we are. Thank you for listening.